So hi everyone, welcome to the first event of the Oxford Economic Society for this academic year. I'm Oscar, the Vice President of our society. I'm glad to welcome you back for another term of exciting discussions. Our events this term are going to be online for obvious safety reasons. If you would like to rewatch our events, they'll be posted to our YouTube channel afterwards. This term, our talks will be covering a range of topics, from the current economic prospects of low-income countries with Professor Hajun Chang, to contemporary central banking policy with former Federal Reserve Chair Ben Bernanke. To kick us off, we are proud to host James Robinson, professor at the Harris School of Public Policy, University of Chicago, to present his recently published book and international bestseller, The Narrow Corridor, and its applications to the current pandemic. The book provides a high-level framework focused on institutions and the contingent nature of major change to explain why some countries allow for more freedom while others fall into authoritarianism. But I'll let Professor Robinson explain that in greater detail. The talk will last 45 minutes, with 15 minutes of questions at the end. Make sure to send in your questions throughout the talk through our Pigeonhole page. The link should be in the description of the event, and I also posted it previously. Thank you for joining us, Professor Robinson. If you'd like to share your screen.
My pleasure, yes. Thanks for inviting me. Okay, here we go. All right, so thanks a lot. Thanks for inviting me. I'm going to talk about my book, The Narrow Corridor. What else would I talk about? State societies and the fate of liberty. So let me just get right into it and say, you could think of the whole book as sort of being based on two claims. And the first claim, which you could say is most contentious. If you agree with the first claim, I think the second one is sort of trivial. Humans want to live in liberty, which I mean what? Well, here's a definition from Locke's second treatise of government: a state of perfect freedom to order their actions and dispose of their possessions and persons as they think fit, without asking leave or depending upon the will of any other man. So this is a sort of canonical definition of, negative liberty, you could say, sort of freedom. People aspire to freedom in this sense, to be able to kind of do what they want, without other people, without having to ask other people's permission or without other people interfering with them. So in some sense, you could say the most sort of contestable claim in the whole book, well, any of the theory could be contestable, but a claim, a issue we could discuss is, this is a universal kind of aspiration of humans. That's the claim. Okay. So if you accept that, then the second thing is very straightforward, which is there's a large amount of variation in the world in the extent to which people enjoy liberty. So most of the book is really trying to provide a parsimonious theory to explain this variation. Where does liberty come from? And why is it that there's just such a massive distribution of liberty? Like some places have much more liberty than others. So if I was going to start by thinking about the theory in the book, and I'd ask, okay, so what's an example of, to start thinking about where liberty or illiberty comes from, what's an example of illiberty? Okay, well, I think the thing that sort of jumps to most people's mind, when you think about that, is something that, Locke thought about too, which is, a situation where a powerful state dominates its citizens. So here's a recent photographer in Tiananmen Square in Beijing. And, when George Orwell wrote 1984, he said, Big Brother is watching you, but Big Brother didn't really have the technological capacity to watch you in 1948 or whenever the book was published. But now he can, and he does. And in China at the moment, they're putting millions of these face recognition cameras up all over the place. So Big Brother can watch you, okay? So this seems to be a situation of illiberty, let's say, okay? And that's familiar, and it's a kind of obvious thing. But obviously that's not the whole story of illiberty, illiberty. And illiberty doesn't just exist in societies where a powerful state dominates people. For example, take Yemen. So Yemen's not a country, with a powerful state. Quite the contrary. The state's almost a cipher. Power is not in the state. power is in society, which is organized through tribes, they say, actually, in the literature, the academic literature on that part of the world. You wouldn't say that if you're talking about Africa, but in the Arabian Peninsula, they talk about tribe. And here's some Yemenis, and you notice in their belt, they have a dagger, So when every boy comes of age, they get given a dagger, and daggers are very important. Daggers, kind of identify your position within the hierarchy and within lineage groups. And if you think about Yemen and the organization of society in Yemen, I always think it's like the opposite of perhaps one of the most canonical definitions of the state in social science, which is due to Max Weber. So Weber sort of said, he defined the state as being that human community that successfully claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of violence within a given territory. Okay, so the Chinese state certainly has the monopoly of violence. I'm not sure if it's legitimate, but it certainly has a monopoly of violence. But in Yemen, in some sense, it's the other way around. It's not the state doesn't have the monopoly of anything. It's society that has, and in that context, I'm actually happy to use the word legitimate. It's society that has the legitimate monopoly of violence, not the state. So it's the sort of the opposite of it's the opposite of what Weber was talking about. Okay, so but obviously this is the sort of polar opposite case from China. It's not the state doesn't dominate society. Society dominates the state. But this doesn't create liberty either. And I think it doesn't create liberty for two reasons. One is a reason that would have been very familiar to Locke, which is a very Hobbesian argument, which is that in Yemen, militarized society engenders feuding, it engenders violence and conflict, and a situation, that Hobbes would have described as war, where the life of man is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, short, and sexist perhaps as well. But you get the idea, okay? But what I want to point out, and I'm not going to be able to get too much into it in 45 minutes, but there's a lot in the book. What I want to point out, what we talk about in the book, is that that's not the only source of illiberty in a society like that. A kind of Hobbesian war is not the only source of illiberty. What you see in societies where the state is very weak like that is a proliferation of norms, what we call the cage of norms, to try to mitigate the consequences of that organization of society. And those norms are often a very potent source of illiberty. Okay, so the state dominates society, or society dominates the state. So that suggests, well, couldn't there be a balance between the two? Okay, and in some sense, that's exactly what the book is about. It's about that balance, and it's about the circumstances under which that balance comes about, and it's about the narrow corridor where that balance comes about. And what we argue in the book, in some sense, and here's the diagram. You're all scholars, so you're not afraid of a phase diagram. The book is all about the narrow corridor as the thing in the middle, and it's the balance between the state and society. So you can see up here on the left, on the vertical axis, there's the power of the state. On the horizontal axis, there's the power of society. China is a case where the state is strong and society is weak, and Yemen, I have Lebanon here, we talk about Lebanon in the book, is, the other way around, where society is strong and the state is weak. But in the middle is where you have a balance, okay? And that's this narrow corridor. Why narrow? Well, because it's difficult to achieve this balance and it's difficult to maintain it. That's where the liberty emerges. That's the argument in the book. So the book is really about sort of motivating this trichotomy. It's very simple, but we hope it's useful as a way of organizing lots of information. So it's about this trichotomy and sort of saying, this helps you explain a lot of the variation you see in the world in liberty. Remember my point number 2. And then a lot of the book is trying to explain, how come the world ended up like that? How come the world got divided into places with different amounts of liberty or illiberty? Okay. And let me give you a flavor of that. You know, it's a 600-page book, so I can only give you a flavor of it. So let me start by asking, you know, so I have in this diagram here, you know, up here in the right-hand corner, you know, where would you say there's most liberty in the world today? You know, well, in my experience, I'd say, you know, that's in Western and Northern Europe. It's in North America, or it used to be. So let me ask, you know, how did Western Europe get like that? You know, how did Western Europe get into the corridor? You know, I claim it's in the corridor. You could say that's an empirical claim, but let's say you agree with me. And let me ask, how did it get in the corridor? How did Western Europe get in, or Northern Europe get into that corridor? And why isn't China in it? And why isn't Yemen in it? You know, I don't, Yemen, I like Yemen. I've never been to Yemen. I'm going to talk about an African example, which I know much more about. Okay, so let me start by asking, how did Europe, you know, get into the corridor, right? And so here's the story we tell, which is, you know, one can cut into this at various moments, but I think what seems to us to be sort of striking about the distinctiveness of Western Europe, for example, is this period at the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, when it's overrun by Germanic tribes, like the Franks. So here's Tacitus in his book Germania describing Germanic tribes. Why was Tacitus interested in Germanic tribes? Well, you know, the Romans had a really difficult time subduing the Germans, and they suffered some humiliating military defeats. So Tacitus wrote this almost kind of ethnographic book trying to understand, you know, what was it about German society that made it so difficult to control? And he's describing the political institutions and legal institutions. Over matters of minor importance, only the chiefs debate. On major affairs, the whole community. The assembly is competent also to hear criminal charges, especially those involving the risk of capital punishment. Assemblies elects, etc. So what he describes is this extremely participatory system of government amongst the Germanic tribes and the Franks. Tacitus doesn't actually talk about the Franks, but he talks about lots of the other ones. And what happens at the collapse of the Western Roman Empire is these very participatory political institutions are fused with late Roman state institutions, administrative institutions, legal institutions, fiscal institutions, not so effectively, but the church was certainly there. And here's the kind of great political entrepreneur of that fusion, King Clovis of the Franks. On the left, he's being baptized, you know, so he's co-opting the church into his new state. And this to us is the sort of really kind of pivotal moment in Western European development. The Merovingian Empire, the Carolingians, they solved this problem of how to fuse the state with these participatory mechanisms of government. On the top here, you know, there's the earliest description that exists of a Carolingian sort of assembly. And this is much later than King Clovis, you know, doing his thing here. But I won't read it out, but just to kind of emphasize here, you know, what's interesting about this is, oh gosh, what happened to me? Something, sorry, my computer went nuts. What's interesting about it, I find what's interesting about it, can you still see me?
Yeah, it's working fine.
Okay, all right, I can't see it, but that's all right. I sort of know what's on it. I don't know what happened to it. Sharing is paused. Okay, sorry, I'm sorry. Something went haywire. Let me.
Take your time.
Yeah, I don't know. Okay, here we are, back to King Clovis. All right, so, all right, there we go. So, you know, what's interesting about this description of a Carolingian assembly is the extent to which it mirrors Tacitus's description. Okay, so you still have this immensely participatory involvement in the organization of the state. And you know, here's something, you know, which King Clovis did do, which is he promulgated the famous Salic law codes. But here's the preface to one of the existing versions of this. Therefore, 4 men, chosen out of many among them, stood out. Wisogast, Arrogast, Saligast, and Widogast. You know, it sounds like Lord of the Rings. They came from beyond the Rhine. You know, the Franks were Germanic tribes. They came from beyond the Rhine, coming together in 3 legal assemblies and discussing the origins and cases carefully. they made judgment on each case as follows. So Clovis might have promulgated the Salic law, but he didn't write it. It's actually a codification of bottom-up social norms and practices of the Franks. It's a very interesting construction, bottom-up construction, participatory construction of a legal system. Okay, so just I think this emphasizes very much the point we want to make. Now, you know, that was a long time ago. That was 1,500 years ago. So in the chapter on Europe, we sort of tell this long kind of dynamics of the corridor. Okay, this is sort of getting you into the corridor, but then it's a process, it's an evolution. And I think, you know, one of the things I like a lot about this book compared to Why Nations Fail, our previous book, is that this model gives much more of a feeling about it's a process. You can't do this thing overnight. The model spreads, okay? So here's a place, some of you maybe even been to this place. This is Runnymede Meadow in typical kind of British overstatement. The birthplace of modern democracy, it says. You know, well, the Magna Carta was hardly modern democracy, but of course it's an interesting constitutional moment. But what I want to emphasize is not the details of the Magna Carta, but the field, you know, where this took place. You know, why did King John and the barons get together in Runnymede Meadow and negotiate this thing? You know, why couldn't they have done it somewhere else? You know, at the Tower of London. Maybe the Tower of London didn't exist in 1215, but they could have done it anywhere. Why here? Well, what's interesting about Runnymede Meadow is this is actually a place where the Anglo-Saxon witan used to meet. So this is 1215. This is after the Norman conquest, but they held this thing where the Anglo-Saxon witan used to meet. So the witan, the witan was the Anglo-Saxon version of the Germanic assemblies, this very participatory way of organizing governance. And that tradition persisted. It persisted, and it created the British Parliament. And, you know, think about Europe, Western Europe, covered in parliaments. Where did all those parliaments come from? This is where they came from, okay? And so we tell the story of, you know, I don't have time to go into it, this dynamics. And let me just emphasize one thing about this dynamics. Getting into the corridor, you know, you could say there's this constitutional moment where Clovis, you know, or King Arthur or whoever it is, you know, King Alfred, you know, configures these institutions, state institutions, these participatory institutions with these particular inheritance. But staying in there is one thing. And also, it's not just a static thing. It's a very dynamic thing, which that diagram is supposed to emphasize, okay? That states develop and societies develop, and states try to control and manage societies, and societies try to control and manage states. And we emphasize that's a very productive process. That's actually how strong states are created. They're not created through some kind of engineering exercise. They're created through a sort of social process, okay? And one of the most interesting kind of British examples of that is from the 18th century. So let me just talk about that for 1 minute. So here's a map from John Brewer's fantastic book, The Sinews of Power, which is about the construction of the modern fiscal state in England, in Britain. And so this is, you know, I like this map. It's the revenue round of Supervisor Cowperthwaite. Supervisor Cowperthwaite in Yorkshire, supervisor in the early 18th century, Supervisor Cowperthwaite went around Richmond and Reeth and Midland, and he was like, look, how much beer did they produce, bread, and all the things that were excise taxes were levied on. So for the first time, the British had a kind of national fiscal administration which penetrated. Suddenly, these people were in your face. Supervisor Cowperthwaite was in your face. So the state gets bigger and more powerful. What does society do? Society reacts. So in his book, Popular Protest in Great Britain, Charles Tilly, the great sociologist Charles Tilly, documented exactly the reaction of the British state in the 18th century, the British society in the 18th century, to this expansion of state power, okay? And he points out a new variety of claim making took shape in Britain. Mass popular politics took hold on a national scale for the first time. The expansion of the state, that's what Brewer was talking about, pushed popular struggles from local arenas and from significant reliance on patronage towards autonomous claim making in national arenas. So the state develops and it tries to control and tax and regulate society. What does society do? Society organizes in response to that. And, you know, why does Tilly end here in 1833, 1832, the first Reform Act, the kind of real start of modern mass democracy in Britain? That's the fruit of this interaction, according to Tilly. So this is the state and society are kind of playing this game, and this process we call the Red Queen effect. So they're competing with each other, okay? And that's the argument really about why strong states and strong societies are very synergetic. In fact, our argument is you don't get a strong state, a really strong state, the way, you know, China was historically. And in fact, you know, if you go back and think about China, you know, you could be thinking, okay, so that's a story about Britain, you know, but the Germanic tribes, well, there were the Mongols, right? You know, so is that no? That's not the story. So if you go back in Chinese history and ask, okay, so where's this radical divergence? When does this take place? In some sense, you know, that's something to do with the Qin dynasty, the first empire. And it's interesting, if you go back before that, you know, you see many similarities with this kind of the type of history I've been talking about in Western Europe. So here's a famous post-Confucian text, the Hunzi. And you know, I can't read Chinese, of course, but one of my friends did this for me. But let me read this out. You know, the king is a boat. The common people are the water. There's the character for water. Water holds up the boat, or water sinks the boat. So the king is the boat. The water can hold up the people, can hold up the boat, or the people can sink the boat. What's that? That's a statement about accountability. Okay, so that's, you know, so this is not so different from what we see, you know, in Western Europe. But then a new model emerges, and here's one of the sort of the intellectual fathers of the Qin dynasty. He died about 100 years before it was established, but Lord Shang, or Shang Yang is his name. And here's a statement, you know, from some of his surviving work, which is very entertaining if you have some time to read it. When the people are weak, the state is strong. Hence, the state that possesses the way strives to weaken the people. Okay, so let me not get into Tao and the way, but just remember his idea: when the people are weak, the state is strong. If you want to make the state strong, you have to weaken the people. Okay, and that's the Chinese model. You know, it's been the Chinese model for almost 2,500 years. And you may know the reason I showed you the cameras. Here's the social credit system. So here's this incredible thing that the Chinese are setting up to micromanage and monitor every person. Okay, but the point that one of the sort of theorems, if you like, in the book, and we actually have a mathematical model of that if you really get into it, is that actually this is not how you create really strong states. Because if you have a really strong state and a weak society, then that's a weaker state than if society is strong. Okay, why? How does that work? What's the mechanism? Well, because you need a strong society to push the state to acquire capacity. If society is prostrate and weak, then the state controls it. It has no incentive to get stronger. That's the argument. Okay, so this Chinese case is, you know, that's what we call in the book a despotic leviathan. Okay. Where you have this balance in the corridor, we call that the shackled leviathan. I'm not so convinced that this terminology is a bit clunky, and Acemoglu and I, you know, we went backwards and forwards as to how useful this is. But you know, we like the connection to Hobbes and this tradition, but it's a bit clunky anyway. So what, you know, why did that equilibrium emerge in China? Well, in some sense, you know, China, my first quote from the Hunzi sort of says, well, China wasn't that, maybe China was in the corridor, it was close to the corridor, but then it sort of veers off. It veers off in this warring states period because this alternative, very despotic model emerges, and that consolidates itself and it becomes very stable over the past 2,500 years. Okay, so how would you think about Yemen? You know, how would you think about this other equilibrium? Well, I was going to give you not a Yemen example, but an African example, which in the part of Nigeria where I've worked, which I know much more about. which is in Tivland. So this is southeastern Nigeria. Here is the what would have been called Tivland in the colonial period. Don't take this ethnic map too seriously. It's just to illustrate, where the Tiv were historically. So what's particularly interesting about the Tiv is, they were what an anthropologist would have called an acephalous society, like a stateless society, prior to, like Yemen, but we know much more, or at least I know much more about the politics of the Tiv than the tribes of Yemen. But what's interesting about the Tiv also is that they were very well studied by anthropologists, particularly the Bohannans, Paul and Laura Bohannan, who were very interested in the politics behind statelessness. Okay, and this is a little bit complicated because it's very connected with witchcraft. So I haven't got time to start talking about witchcraft, but witchcraft is really a theory of causality, or it's a theory of suffering and illness, which pervades, African life. And so witchcraft is a sort of tool here that comes in, which is not relevant in other parts of the world, but which is somehow idiosyncratic. I mean, of course, there's witchcraft everywhere, but it's much more prevalent, at least in my personal experience, in African society than elsewhere. And it comes into this discussion. But let me sort of try to summarize what the important argument here is about why the Tiv ended up in a situation like in Yemen, where society dominated the state. And one way to think about that is they ended up in that situation exactly because they were anxious about what would happen to them if central power, if a state emerged. This is one of the things that John Locke was, if you've read the second treatise on government, was particularly concerned about, which is, how do you exit from what he called the inconveniences of the state of nature? You do that by creating a sort of state that can resolve disputes. But once you've created this thing, how do you control it? Okay, that's exactly what the Tiv were concerned about. And the equilibrium they reached was one where when anyone sort of got too big for their boots or got too powerful, they were immediately whittled down by witchcraft accusations. So here's a diviner. If you think someone's attacking you with witchcraft in Africa, what you do is go to a diviner, and the diviner will sort of try to interpret or, try to understand the nature of the problem. And here's a Tiv diviner. This is a photograph that Bohannan took in the early 1950s. And here's his fly whisk. Okay, so the fly whisk was something you used to smell out the role of witchcraft and witches. Okay, and so what Bohannan points out is that, men who acquired too much power were whittled down by means of witchcraft accusations. Nyambua, which is this cult he was talking about, was one of a regular series of movements to which Tiv political action, with its distrust of power, give rise to, so that the greater political institutions, one based on the lineage system and the principle of egalitarianism, can be preserved. So I emphasize, I bold-face distrust of power. So this is exactly what Locke was worried about. Locke was very skeptical that power was going to be misused unless you could sort of control it. And the Tiv couldn't figure out how to control it. It's not that they didn't see the advantages of hierarchy, but they thought that it would eliminate the egalitarianism of the lineage system. So the solution was to stop hierarchy emerging to start with. Okay, so this is a very important mechanism in the book. Okay, so that's that's the mechanism. That's the idea. There's a sort of, the state wants to dominate society, but society is concerned about that. And that can lead to two equilibria. It can lead to this despotic leviathan, like China, or the anticipation of that can lead to a kind of acephalous equilibrium like the Tiv or Yemen or many other parts of the world. And it's balancing those two things that gets so tricky. And that's what you can do in the narrow corridor. Okay, that's the main idea of the book, sort of to try to elaborate on those mechanisms and to tell, give you ideas about what explains this variation. You can see that the way I talk about the difference between China and Western Europe emphasizes a lot, or even Africa emphasizes a lot, idiosyncratic features of those societies. You know, I'm not one of these people who think you can explain the way the world is by appealing to geography or whether you grow wheat or rice. I think that for me, the big fact about human history is the incredible creativity of humans in terms of the types of societies and institutions that they create, the types of problems or kind of mental models that they create. And I think these, you know, these innovations have enormous path-dependent consequences. And you know, so there's a lot of idiosyncrasy. So there's a lot to think through there. But let me just talk about a few things, because I promised to talk about COVID, and then I should shut up in 5 minutes, I think, or 7 minutes, according to my watch. So, you know, what's the proof of the pudding is in the eating, my mum used to say, you know. So what are some of the implications? I won't talk about all of them, just a few. You know, Lord Shang was wrong. You know, in our theory, the state is most powerful not when society is weak, but when society is strong. So that's a theorem. You know, you could say that's testable and whatever. Okay, so, you know, the end of history, I'm old enough to have lived through the collapse of communism and the Berlin Wall and the prediction about the end of history. I at the time, I found that bizarre, and I still find it bizarre. You know, for me, the big pattern in world history is not convergence, it's divergence. You know, different parts of the world are in fundamentally different equilibria, it seems to me. And, you know, 20 or 30 years economic growth and modernization is not going to change that, okay? So, and lots of other things here. You know, also the TIV example I like, you know, and many other African examples which are in the book, is because there's nothing uniquely Western about liberty. I talk about John Locke, you know, but this is not some parochial thing. It's just better dominated than African political thinkers. You know, the liberty, the notion of liberty is everywhere in the world, it seems to me. And I can't get into that here, but, you know, that's part of, you know, I said to start with, maybe the more kind of controversial claim is that liberty is a sort of, that's an aspiration for all human beings. Okay, so there's like a slice of evidence on that. Okay, so let me just say a little bit about COVID. So how do you think, what's COVID in here? Well, you could say, you know, this is a very Hobbesian moment, you know. So think about, our theory says, you know, there's these different societies in the world. You know, you have some places in the corridor like New Zealand, you have China or Vietnam, which are much more despotic. You know, then you have Yemen or whatever it is, you know, Central African Republic, Sierra Leone. And so what would be the consequences of this shock? Well, I think, you know, if you thought about it as a very Hobbesian moment, then you might think people want the state, you know, they want security, they want the state to do things. The state needs to take on all these tasks, you know, it's never had to do before, to lock down people, make them stay at home, etc., etc. You know, so that seems to be something that ought to, like, in some sense, strengthen the state. So you could imagine that reinforces this Chinese equilibrium, or, you know, you could even imagine that it kind of knocks societies in, you know, in the corridor, out of the corridor. Perhaps in Yemen, it helps them encourage building a state. So you can see straight away, and I think this is one of the interesting things about the book, is that when you start talking about, you know, what an economist would call like comparative statics, the results are very different depending on where you are in this diagram, right? So there's no like one prediction here. The prediction very much depends on where you are in this diagram, right? So in China, this could reinforce despotism, but in Yemen, the sort of demand for greater coordination or capacity of the state could actually maybe move you towards the corridor. So that could be a bad thing in China, but it could be a good thing in Yemen. What about if you're in the corridor? Well, what I see, and this is a theme of the book that I haven't had time to talk about, is that there's a lot of heterogeneity in the corridor. You know, there's New Zealand and there's the United States, but look at how differently they've operated. You know, New Zealand has been a sort of fantastic success because people trust the government. You know, the government says, look, we should do this, and they say, okay, let's cooperate. I mean, there were a few anomalous people, you know, but what's happened in the United States, like mass civil disobedience, you know, in Chicago, in Cook County, You know, the governor of Illinois closed all these national parks. What happened? You know, thousands of people just went anywhere. They parked illegally. They went into national parks and they were like, you know, to hell with you. You know, I'm just going to do what I like. I don't care what you said. You don't have the right to keep me out of this national park. So people won't cooperate with the government, you know, because for ideological reasons, because they don't trust the government to act in the collective interest. Okay. So there's a lot of heterogeneity, you know, within these different societies. So some, you know, in the case of New Zealand, you could say that's actually really kind of, COVID has had the effect of really reconfirming this equilibrium. You know, the people trust the state, you know, the state acts in their common interest. COVID doesn't spread. There's very few people died. They can all watch rugby, you know, in the stadium. And so, you know, this is great. That like really pushes you ahead in the corridor. In the US, you have a different initial situation. You don't really trust the state. So the state can't do what it's supposed to do. So a lot of people die. So you don't, you know, so what does that mean? It means I see divergence even within the corridor. You know, you see some places, you know, I don't think the Anglo-Saxon model of distrust of government, which is something that's been inculcated, you know, since the days of Mrs. Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, that doesn't seem to have created a very propitious context for dealing with this problem. But other places have done differently, you know, so it's a sort of huge social science natural experiment. You know, it's very complicated to talk about, as you see. But like part of, as I said, like to emphasize here, I haven't got time to talk about this, you know, but one thing we talk about, we use the framework to talk about some classic kind of issues in social science, like what's the impact of warfare? You know, does war make states, or do states make war? You know, how does that work? Well, it depends on where you are in the diagram, okay? So let me just end like by saying, I'll end by saying, you know, here's one thing about institutions that kind of really strikes me about COVID, which I find fascinating and I think optimistic. You know, I'm not known for my optimism, you know, but what's interesting about, you know, think about climate change or global warming. You know, isn't that the biggest problem facing humanity at the moment? You know, the fact that our actions are potentially going to make the whole planet uninhabitable. And that's, you know, as every economist knows, there's an enormous collective action problem in dealing with this problem. Okay, and it's very hard to build institutions. And one of the reasons I think is just that our psychology, you know, evolved for millions of years when we were sitting in the East African savannah, you know, and it evolved to deal with the types of problems that we had in the East African savannah. Like, oh my gosh, there's a lion in my face. You know, I need to do something about that. Thinking about climate change, that's just a problem we can't handle. It's just too nebulous. But what's fascinating about COVID is that that's so visceral. You know, it's in your face. You've got to deal with it, or you're going to die. You know, or your relatives are going to die, or your family's going to die. And it's not my problem. It's everyone's problem. We're all people. We're all humans living on this planet. We all have to deal with this problem. We can't really isolate ourselves from it. So I think it's a sort of wake-up call for building international kind of global institutions of a sort that haven't really worked before. And if you build those to deal with one problem, why can't you use them for dealing with other problems? I think the history of institutions suggests that, you know, you could build institutions for doing one thing, but once they're there, they provide a basis for thinking about all sorts of other things. So actually, ironically enough, I think this is a moment where one could be much more optimistic than in my lifetime about the potential for building global institutions to deal with the global problems that, you know, that humanity faces, that so far we've been pretty pathetic at dealing with. Okay, I think I should leave it there on that note.
Great, thank you very much. So we've got some questions coming in, a couple which are quite interesting. So I'll start with this one. So which factors do you think are then the most promising for explaining what moves countries in or out of the corridor or across countries outside of Europe? How does colonialism fit into this? And how come, for example, so you mentioned how China has had a historically really strong state. Why did that emerge? What were the factors that led it to develop that certain way?
Yeah, I mean, those are all great questions. Just to go in reverse order, I think that's a sort of intellectual revolution, the Chinese case. I think if you think about the context of the warring states period. It was an intellectual revolution that sort of said, here's a solution to our problems. Here's a model of how we organize society. And the Qing state managed to implement that, and so I think that's really a sort of, it's like it's like an intellectual innovation more than anything else. But it was, but with a practical plan, if you go back and think about the Qing state, or, with a practical plan for how you organize society, how you micromanage it, and which turned out to be very successful and very effective. So I think that's the way I think about that. If you think about the Islamic world, like what was that? That was an intellectual revolution too. That was Muhammad building a state, coming up with a whole sort of the Sharia, and this is the way to think about what we should be doing and how society should be organized. And that's what Locke was trying to do too. Locke was trying to come up with a sort of plan for how to, here's the problem, like a sense of what the problems are, and here's the solution. So I would think of it like that in some sense. And colonialism, colonialism, I think is the way I would talk about that. I mean, we've written a lot about colonialism. There's less about colonialism in this book than in our academic research or Why Nations Fail. But that's obviously a very important part of this process. I mean, what is it that makes it very difficult in Africa today to build, national legitimate political authority? Well, the ludicrous state system that was inherited from colonialism. Colonialism took, all of these hundreds of different people. It took the Tiv, it took the Tiv and the Igbo and the Bibio and the Nupe and the Yoruba and the Hausa and the Fulani, and stuck them all in this thing and said, you're all Nigerians now, and like, just, for me, the post-colonial history of Africa is just showing how difficult it is to like build legitimate institutions. The parts of Africa that have done it, like Botswana or maybe Somaliland, in the last 30 years, arguably, have managed to sort of build a kind of, create a little sort of niche where they can do this in a legitimate way from the bottom up, building on traditional aspects of society. And like I always love the example in the US, we have a Senate, and each state has 2 representatives, but that makes absolutely no sense in Somaliland, because first of all, people are moving around with their flocks and their goats and their camels. And so what is a reasonable way of thinking about the Senate? Representation of the clans and the sub-clans. So the Senate is based on representation of the clans. Okay, the British would never have thought about that. When the British were sort of foisting some, model of democratic institutions on Somalia, they would have never thought of doing something like that. The Somalis had to kind of cut themselves the space to sort of say, this is how we want to organize our own society. And it's, and that's what needs to happen in Africa, but that's obviously, that's a very, very hard thing to do in the Congo or Nigeria. Or what was the other question?
Just to understand the factors that push the state within this framework. And it seems like it's mainly exogenous. So colonialism or pandemic.
I think, the way we tend to think about the world is that, there are what we called in Why Nations Fail, these sort of critical junctures. There's big moments where societies get reformed and reshaped, like, when the Qin dynasty emerged, or, when the Clovis started the Merovingians, and, we talk about that quite a lot in Why Nations Fail. Colonialism, shaped many societies in particular ways. And after that, things are very persistent. There's a lot of path dependence, so and those equilibria, sometimes they're fragile, but I guess we also, emphasize a lot the sort of persistence. I mean, this is one thing that I guess we talk about this in the new book. I'm not sure I completely understand it, but think about Germany. If you thought about the history of, I mean, after all, the Germanic tribes, Germany, and you're thinking, okay, what about the creation of an absolutist state, after 1648, after the 30 Years' War in Germany? What about the Nazi state? That doesn't sound too shackled, So what you see is that, society sort of crash out of the corridor. But what's, to me, is fascinating, and I have a micro foundation for this, is that, those instances, of course, can bring enormous amount of misery and chaos to the world. But when they collapse, there's somehow the equilibrium bounces back. You know, when the Nazi state collapsed, the Germans were able to get back and write a constitution and recreate this inclusive society. You know, the same thing, you know, after the Battle of Jena, for example, you know, when the Prussian absolutist project kind of crashed, same thing happened. You know, the old institutions bounced back, the estates bounced back, and the society kind of reasserted itself. So I think, you know, this is something we've actually been trying to think about, like theoretically, like what's the right way to think about the mechanisms? You know, it's almost like there's some sort of collective understanding of this is how we do things, you know, and that's something which, you know, is lacking in Nigeria, for example, where you don't have such a collect. But the Germans somehow, I don't know how to, I don't have a theory of that, but so that's just to say, yeah, there's, you know, there's just to sort of emphasize that, you know, you're probably thinking of, like, he's talking about persistence, but, you know, what about these, you know, you all know these periods of European history which have been pretty cataclysmic and don't sound so shackled. And I'm just sort of alluding to how we think about that, you know, without doing justice to all the details, of course. So you know, so that's our view, you know, that there are moments when lots of things are fluid and in play. And then once things kind of come together, they tend to be very persistent. So I think, you know, I tend to think that, you know, that's why I say, you know, I think the Chinese society is very impervious to the types of forces that many social scientists think, you know, we're going to create liberal democracy. There's no historical model of liberal democracy in China, you know, although there's many interesting attempts to think about what, you know, a Chinese model of democracy would look like. There's a whole bunch of scholars actually writing about Confucian democracy, which I actually find super fascinating because it's the Chinese people themselves thinking about how to do this. It's not us telling them how to do it. And that's a big, you know, like much of colonialism is reproduced, you know, in the modern world, in Africa, for example, by the way that we interact with Africans, but by the way development economics, you know, interacts with Africans, by the way, you know, it's like, you know, like think about Macron in Lebanon, you know, Macron telling the Lebanese what to do, you know, who, you know, like, come on, give the Lebanese a break, leave them alone. They'll sort it out.
Great. So the core idea is an institutionalist explanation where you have some institutions that are set up, some mechanisms that hold it in place, and then there'll be some exogenous shock, which will shake things up a bit. And then often that's the part where the society comes back in. So quickly,
Yes.
how does this fit it then into your broader framework that was developed in Why Nations Fail about the road to prosperity? Because in Why Nations Fails, you extensively emphasized institutional explanations for economic development specifically, and you reject some other explanations like the cultural one. But here in your talk, it seems like you're bringing back the role of civil society in explaining structural change. So how does this new book fit into the old framework? Is it a revision of the old framework, or is it enriching it? Does it provide greater detail to the nature of inclusive and extractive institutions?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would think of it, I would think of it as doing several things. I think on the one hand, we're trying to sort of broaden the agenda by talking about liberty. You know, we're not just talking about GDP or kind of material living standards. We'd like, maybe unsuccessfully, but, you know, we'd like to broaden the agenda. But I think the way to think about it in you know, relative to Why Nations Fail is that it's a much more complete idea of where inclusive political institutions come from. You know, and there's new mechanisms. You know, Why Nations Fail, we emphasize very much this kind of elite, you know, versus citizens point of view. I mean, I think civil society is very much in Why Nations Fail, but it's very much, you know, what creates extractive institutions. You know, it's elites. You know, elites capture society or elites dominate society. But I guess the more and more we thought about that, we talk about this, you know, at the start of Why Nations Fail, like this is problematic. We give this example of Somalia, interestingly enough, and we sort of say, well, we're going to say Somalia has extractive institutions because, you know, because even though it's very participatory, it doesn't have a state, and we're going to call that extractive, you know. But that's just a way of sort of trying to project this complicated thing into a simple dichotomy. But the more we thought about it, the more we were unhappy with that, and the more we thought it masked all sorts of interesting dynamics. So I think this Yemen example, you know, that's something that we can't really cope with in Why Nations Fail. So, but once you bring that in, you see, well, this is not a society with very inclusive institutions, but the reason it's not very inclusive is dramatically different from China. And those differences are very important, for people's welfare, but they're also very important, for what you have to do to change that society, So I don't think it's contradictory of Why Nations Fail. I see those two things, both kind of broadening the agenda and sort of trying to make these, give a deeper understanding of where these political institutions come from. And also, if you've read Why Nations Fell, it's really horrible. The discussion of China, is horrible, like very superficial. And the discussion of India is like absent, so if you read the new book, you'll see we've spent a lot of time trying to understand those cases better. And life is short. There's too much to do. I mean, I think, I think, your view of the world tends to be very shaped by the where you grew up and by the types of societies you study. And, I grew up in different parts of the developing world and in England, and I studied a lot Latin America and worked in Latin America and Colombia for almost 30 years now in sub-Saharan Africa. And so your view is very shaped by those societies. And you tend to kind of build theories, based on that, which you then project into the rest of the world. And I guess, as I've got older and thought more, the worse and worse that kind of methodology is, because, like, think about it, most social theory is essentially an interpretation of Western political development projected into the rest of the world, on the assumption that everyone's the same, but everyone isn't the same, So I guess this is, this should be kept from my confessor, perhaps.
Great. I had one more question, which was on future research plans and how you plan to enrich this framework. Are there any potential cases that you'd like to study or factors that seem particularly interesting?
I think, so as my last comments probably clarified, I've been trying to immerse myself in other, much more in the history of other parts of the world, of China, of India, I've been doing a lot of field work in Africa in the last 10 years, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in Sierra Leone, most recently in Nigeria, trying to come to terms with, the different ways that different societies think. I don't know if you want to call that cultural. I don't care what words people use, but, I think if you think about Chinese conceptions of society and social order, they're actually very different from the way John Locke thought about it. And that's also true in sub-Saharan Africa. And it's true in the Islamic world as well. Notions of the state and people's relationship to the state. Think about it like this. When you study political economy at Oxford, PPE, they probably tell you about, the problem of collective choice. It may even tell you about Arrow's famous theorem about aggregating preferences. And so you start with this idea that there's a sort of society of sovereign people who have these different preferences, and we have to the state's job is to aggregate them, and that's complicated. That way of thinking about the state is totally irrelevant in the Islamic world, because the role of the state is not to legislate or aggregate preferences. The role of the state is to implement the Sharia. You know what the law is already. The problem is to implement it. And if you study, for example, like what sort of state did the Taliban want to create in Afghanistan? Like all the presuppositions are completely different from what you're going to learn in political economy. And I'm not saying that political economy, I've taught political economy for 30 years, so I don't want to, soar off the limb I'm standing on. But I just think we just don't take these things seriously enough. We don't take other people's views of the world seriously enough. So I guess what I'm trying to do at the moment, I don't know what I'm going to do about this. I actually just gave some lectures about this last week. I don't know what I'm going to do about this. I'm doing lots of little things like you usually do as an academic. Trying to write models of these different things down and try to understand them. But I guess I'm trying to find ways of thinking more systematically about the way that there are ideas out there in social science, but I don't really like any of them. Like, for example, You know, there's a book, there's lots of stuff about collectivism versus individualism. You know, Western society is individualistic, and, you know, Eastern society is collectivist, you know, but I don't find that very interesting, that distinction, honestly, you know. And so that's what I'm struggling with. I'm struggling to come up with I don't think we have a really genuinely comparative political economy or genuinely comparative politics, if you want my honest opinion. That's the conclusion I've come to in the last 10 years. And I don't know what I'm going to do about that, but that's what I'm working on. I'm trying to understand, you know, but that's fun. It's good to have something to think about at my age.
Great. Thank you very much. For all those watching, remember that on Thursday we have an event with Professor Damodaran on COVID-19's impact on the world economy. It's at 5:30. Make sure to tune in. Thank you very much, Professor Robinson, for joining us today, and good luck with all your projects.
My pleasure. Yes, my pleasure.